All right, Amici, welcome back to our next video. Last time around, we took a look at demand, the law of demand, and then we took demand and we did demand curve shifts. And we identified 6 non-price factors that would shift demand, AKA kill the existing original demand curve and replace it with a new demand curve that would either be shifted to the right if demand went up or to the left if demand fell. Now we're going to jump from the demand side over to the supply side. And in this video, we're going to look at changes in supply and supply curve shifts. Okay, so remember that when we're doing our supply analysis, the progression and the framework will follow demand. But again, you have to get out of the buyer mentality and get into the seller mentality. Okay. At the end of it all, even though things get related and come together, the things that influence buyers are totally different than the things that influence sellers. So to understand today's video, it's really crucial that you get yourself thinking from the lens of the seller. The seller's incentives, you'll recall, are to make profit, and tied to that, to reduce the cost of production. Okay, it's a little hint for you for the next couple minutes. All right. So as was the case with demand, let's start. A change in supply will shift the supply curve and in turn change equilibrium. Changes in supply are caused by non-price factors. That's important, okay? You'll recall that supply is defined as a seller's willingness to sell a product at every possible price, and therefore the supply idea embodies the whole curve. Whereas on the other hand, the quantity supplied is the amount a seller will offer at one specific price, and that corresponds to one specific point on a supply curve. So again, that crucial distinction between quantity supplied and supply, okay? To recap that in terms of how it affects a supply curve, when there is a price change, this will lead to a change in quantity supplied. Think back to our law of supply. Law of supply said that if price goes up, quantity supply changes, not supply. This will be another midterm question. I'm going to say something to you like on your midterm. True or false? If price goes up, supply goes up. The answer is false. Price changes do not affect supply. They affect quantity supply. Okay. So when there's a price change, it's going to lead to a change in quantity supplied. There will be a movement along the existing supply curve from one point to another, from a point representing the original price to a point representing the new price, but they're on the existing supply curve. So there will not be a shift, there will be a movement, okay? It's gonna look something like this. Suppose that the price is equal to $3, and at $3, this market will supply, I don't know, we'll just talk about pizzas to keep it consistent. This market will supply 5 pizzas, okay? So sellers, that is suppliers, at a price of $3, we go over, we go down, and they will supply 5 pizzas. Suppose that something happens and now the price of pizza goes to $11. If the price of pizza goes up to 11, go across, and we hit here, an increase in the price of pizza, that's step 1, will move us from this point to this point. That's step 2. And then, I don't know, make this 10. That'll lead us from this Q to this Q. And that's our third piece, okay? So a change in supplies, a change in price will simply move you from one price to another, which corresponds to a movement along the supply curve, which corresponds to a change in the QS, okay? It's really important to bear that in mind. A change in price leads to a change in quantity supplied, okay? If you kind of want to really see the next couple of seconds, take a look at it. We can explain it more when we're live. It would actually work out like this. Here's the technical sequence of events. Suppose that the equilibrium price is $10. The way that it would actually play out in the real world is, suppose that demand increased. So this is D0. Suppose that demand increased. So demand goes up from D0 to D1. Draw that big arrow there, right? There's going to be a new equilibrium, and that new equilibrium is going to correspond to a higher price. So the way that would manifest in the real world is an increase in demand, for example, would raise the price, and that would move sellers along the existing supply curve from here to here, and that explains why the quantity goes up, okay? But the bigger point to bear in mind is the difference between price changes and non-price changes. And that leads us to our final part of this. When something other than price, AKA a non-price factor, changes, we call this a change in supply. Not a change in quantity supplied, but a change in supply, because as a result of this non-price factor, the original supply curve dies and it's replaced by a new curve. And this new curve will be to the right if supply increases, and will be to the left if supply were to fall. Either way, whether supply increases or decreases, once S0 dies and is replaced by the new supply curve S1, equilibrium changes, and therefore P and Q in that market change. Let's do a couple of real quick ones to figure it out. We have demand here. We're going to call this S0. And we're going to say we have an equilibrium price of 10 and a quantity of 20, whatever. Suppose that something happens and supply goes up. That's going to lead us to shift our supply curve to the right to S1. We're going to put a big arrow there to show that direction. And now with this new supply curve, we're going to have a new equilibrium shown by N for new. We're going to drop a line down and a line across, and we will see that when supply increases, we would predict in a market it's going to push prices down and also increase supply in that market. Okay, let's erase that real quick, and we'll do it again just the other way to make sure you really lock that in. All right, so let's go back. We originally had supply 0 and demand. We had S&D meeting at equilibrium. We'll just say that that price was $10, quantity of 20. Now let's say that something happens to restrict supply and that supply falls. Well, that's going to lead to a leftward shift. So we're going to go from S0 there to S1 to the left. We're going to draw ourselves an arrow to really illustrate that. We have a new equilibrium indicated by the letter N. And if we draw a dotted line down and a dotted line across, we have a new equilibrium quantity and a new equilibrium price. And we would predict, my friends, that when supply falls, prices will rise and quantity at equilibrium, the quantity supplied, will fall. Okay, so that's the way it's going to play out. Now, with that said, our final thing is to identify what are those non-price factors that will cause supply to shift. And I'm going to offer to you here that there are 7. Okay, the first one will be, actually, before I give you the first one, I want to give you a little hint on this. And this is always a bit of a tough one to remember, because most of us don't sell for a living. We buy all the time, so the demand shifters are their second nature. The supply shifters, however, require you to get in the head of a person selling. So the little hint I'm going to give you is, when you think about the factors that shift a supply curve, think about the incentives of a firm. And that incentive is to make and maximize profit. And we know that profit is equal to total revenue minus total cost. So the hint I'm going to give you is, as we go through these 7 shifters, these 7 non-price factors, I would always focus on the cost angle, specifically what I would call the COP, right? The cost of production or the cost of doing business. If you can identify how each of these 7 factors influences or affects the company's cost of doing business, you can then figure out its effect on their profit and then its effect on their incentive. Okay, so let's jump in. The first of the 7 is going to be a change in resource prices. We know that resources include land, labor, and capital. In the production process, it would include things like energy prices, labor prices, raw material prices, all your input prices. So in this one, we're talking about input prices. And the general rule is, if your input prices fall, your supply will increase. And if your input prices rise, your supply will decrease. Think about this from the point of view of the supplier. If input prices fall, if labor is cheaper, if raw materials are cheaper, if energy prices fall, your profits go up because your cost of production is going down. And when that happens, you're very happy and you have an incentive to produce more, to make more profit, and that will raise your supply. If, on the other hand, your input prices rise, maybe you have an energy price spike, maybe you have workers unionizing and they're arguing for higher wages, maybe Congress passes a minimum wage law, which raises your labor rates. All of those input prices going up will reduce profits, thereby reducing the incentive to produce, thereby driving supply down, okay? So our first factor is going to be a change in input prices. Let's get rid of this right here and go back. The next thing that will affect supply is going to be the development of new technology and automation. We've discussed before with the PPF curve and economic growth, the idea of technology and the importance of technical skill to grow an economy. We see a piece of that here. Anytime you have new production technology or automation or other types of high-tech things, they're going to drive down the cost of production. So we're simply going to say that new production technologies will almost always increase supply. Okay, let's get rid of this here. Our third one, this ties into the idea of opportunity cost. Changes in the profitability of alternative products. Let's do a simple example. Let's say that you're a farmer and you are growing soybeans. So you're a farmer, you're making a decent living on all your acreage growing soybeans. Now let's say that something happens that for some reason, we don't need to know the reason for now, but for some reason, the price of corn were to go up. Well, if you're a farmer and you're making a certain amount of profit on soybeans, but something happens in the economy and now you realize, oh, damn, I can make a lot more money growing corn. I mean, you've got the land, you've already got your labor, you've got your tractors. All you'd really have to do is rip up your soil and plant corn seed, basically. You already got all the other ingredients there to grow, just a matter of what you're going to grow, right? Well, if you realize that corn is more valuable, you're going to rip out your soybean crop and plant corn. And that's going to lead to the supply of soybeans falling while the supply of corn rises. This one's a little bit tricky, but if you think about the opportunity cost, okay, let's say that something were to happen, let's go back, and let's say that you were growing soybeans. Let's say that you had a split field, and half of your field was soybeans and half of your field was corn. And something happened and the price of corn fell dramatically. Well, this now makes soybeans relatively more profitable. Seen in a technical jargon, it makes the opportunity cost of growing corn higher. Remember, the opportunity cost of an item is what you give up. Okay, so if the price of corn falls and soybeans are now more valuable, relatively speaking, growing corn has a higher opportunity cost. So you would likely rip out your corn crop, plant soy, and we would see in the market the supply of soy go up while the supply of corn fell. Okay, so that's our third one. Let's get rid of this real quick. Good. Our fourth is a very simple one, the entry and exit of sellers. In competitive markets, we believe that it should be fairly easy and low cost for new firms to enter and for existing firms to leave if they choose. The entry and exit of sellers will affect supply. If more sellers come into the market, supply will go up. And if more sellers leave the market, supply will go down. You're simply asking, what is the number of suppliers? Entry in, supply goes up. Exit of sellers out, supply goes down. The fifth thing, this is a pretty big one, especially in the third world that's still pretty agrarian. But in general, supply shocks or changes in weather, these things will typically reduce supply. If we see agrarian agricultural societies and they have a drought year or really bad flood year, these are called supply shocks, and these will typically reduce the supply of the crop. We can also see supply shocks in the industrial rich world when something happens that, for example, spikes the price of oil. If there is something that goes on, whether it's the demand or the supply of oil, and the price of oil goes sky high, that would be considered a supply shock that could really hurt the economy. Because if the price of oil goes up, supply will fall dramatically because so many products that we make and consume require oil, either for the actual production of the product or for the transport of the product across international borders, okay? So we have supply shocks. Another one that will happen, this ties to the institutions, changes in regulations or subsidies or taxes. It's generally going to be up to you to identify the specific event. But basically, any regulation that makes life on business people easier will increase supply. And any regulation that is burdensome for businesses will decrease supply, okay? Subsidies are, and I'm going to put this in quotes because there's no free lunch, but you can think of subsidies as free money that is given by the government to sellers to incentivize some kind of production. Subsidies as free money make sellers very happy and therefore raise supply. Taxes, on the other hand, can be seen as an additional cost. Taxes are an additional cost. Business owners are not fans of taxes because it raises their cost of production, so taxes will reduce supply. And our seventh and final one, it's the same, just the opposite of our demand expectation change, but from the seller's point of view, changes in future prices, or sorry, the expectation of changes in future prices will affect supply. Okay, let's go through the ifs really quick. Remember, most sellers will produce things and they'll keep some in inventory and some in reserve and sell a piece of it, right? They don't always sell everything they make. Some is kept in reserve and held. Okay, if a seller, if you expect the price to go up in the future, you will likely hold some of your supply in inventory. Wait till the price goes up and then sell it at the higher price. So if you expect prices to go up, you'll withhold some supply from the market and supply will go down. If, on the other hand, you're a seller and you expect the price to go down in the future, then you're going to want to get stuff out of inventory today, get it on the shelves at today's higher price, and sell it today before the price falls in the future, and therefore supply will go up. Of course, I hope that you noticed the subtle paradox here that if you expect prices to fall, so you increase supply, you will actually make prices fall and reinforce the expectation. Or if you expect prices to go up, you'll hold back on supply, which will in fact lead prices to go up, which reinforces your expectation. And once again, human psychology can combine with economics to give us some vicious cycles or virtuous cycles, or in this case, speculation and bubbles. Okay? So my friends, as a quick recap, we have now wrapped up changes in supply, shifts in supply. It's critical that you remember the difference between a change in quantity supplied and a change in supply, and that you know, like the back of your hand, the 7 factors, the 7 non-price factors, the 7 shifters that will move supply. And that's resource costs, technology and automation, alternative product profitability, the number of sellers, supply shocks and weather changes, regulations, subsidies, and tax changes, and future expectations. At this point now, you're able to shift supply curves. In our next lecture, we're going to take those supply curve shifts, take those demand curve shifts, and you're going to be able to make predictions on market movements. I'll see you next time. Thank you.